demand management. Demand management and behavior change, so including government direction of changes in ethics and culture. So a fundamental societal transformation isn't going to be and can't be consumer driven. The IPCC acknowledges this, and so the report devotes substantial attention to how to change people's choices. Now when I read it, it strikes me as Orwellian, but this is the way they refer to it. And they talk about dietary choices need to be changed. This is discussed in chapter 4. They don't give specifics on this, but there is a group that is a commission founded by EAT, which is a foundation, and Lancet, the British Medical Journal. The EAT-Lancet Commission has developed a climate diet to fit into this, and this is now being promoted by the UN and in particular the World Health Organization to governments around the world for instituting this. A typical diet under this would be 1 egg per week, 1/2 ounce of meat per day, less than 1/2 ounce of meat per day, 2.5 ounces of beans, 10 ounces of vegetables, 8 ounces of fruit, 8 ounces of grain, a few other things. But that would be for approximation. So there's someone laid out, actually they laid out a sample of what they think this would be a representative daily diet. Great. The BBC had an interesting article about this, and BBC World pointed out that this would require massive shifts. The idea is to have massive shifts in diets worldwide, everywhere. And BBC frames it this way. What changes am I going to have to make? And to put it very simply, Steele, I would not voluntarily purchase this diet. And I think very few people would. I don't think very many of you would. In fact, I already know that because none of you, I don't know that none of you are, but every one of us could purchase this now. And almost none of us are eating this diet, so it's not something we're doing voluntarily. So how do we institute this? And ultimately, it can't be left to consumer choice. This is the kind of thing that would have to be imposed by rationing or compulsion of some sort if you were to see this imposed worldwide, or something like it. When the IPCC refers to people having to make different dietary choices, it's Orwellian. They're not the ones who are choosing this. It's a diet plan by experts, and it's now being promoted to governments around the world to implement. The director of the, Lena Gordon, who is director of the Stockholm Resilience Center, puts it this way. She says, it's time to dream of a good world. I don't think it's a good world, but we'll leave it to you. The IPCC SR15 is hundreds of pages long, and there's much more to discuss. And I will talk just a little bit more about it, but too much. But one thing that they endorse one thing they mention is Gwendolir. I don't understand what this has to do with what is alleged to be a scientific report on climate. But they mentioned Gwendolir as a model from which we can learn. And a quick summary of some of the things that they call for are rapid abolition of fossil fuels, rapid development of wind, solar, and biofuels, skepticism about carbon removal, and skepticism about nuclear energy, government management of consumption, travel, and ethics, and, I almost forgot, massive wealth redistribution to promote equality. What they're talking about in particular, they talk about the need for within a country, but in particular, international government-to-government transfers of wealth that will supposedly eliminate poverty. I nearly made a slide on this, but it's too economic. Didn't want to do it, so I've got it here if you ever want to see it. But government-to-government transfers to eliminate poverty don't work. I've got something here I can wave around later. The IPCC cautions us that fairness and equality are not the same as treating people equally. This is a quote from their document. So I don't know what it means, but it is. They propose this as a framework to be adopted by national governments to fit national conditions. So let's look at a proposal for a U.S. version. And the U.S. version is the Green New Deal. Is that it? Yes, that is. The Green New Deal. Now, the Green New Deal is, we've all heard of it, it's not legislation, but it's a proposal for developing legislation that would fit a certain framework, particular framework. It was, the Green New Deal idea was introduced jointly by Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey, New York and Massachusetts respectively. And since it's not specific legislation, I'm going to talk about the version of it as they proposed it. And it could be altered, but I'm going to give you first just a little bit of history of it. Dave Roberts, who is a writer for Vox, has an excellent review of the history. He's a supporter of this and has tracked it for some time. But he dates the Green New Deal idea, the term Green New Deal dates back at least to 2007. It was used by Thomas Friedman in a New York Times article, or op-ed, and also a British climate group connected to the UK's Labour Party used this term in some of their work. And in 2008, the United Nations had a Green New Deal working group. So it's an idea that's been kicked around and developed. And the Ocasio-Cortez version, the Ocasio-Cortez-Markey version, is a call for radical restructuring of the U.S. economy and society. And so I want to talk first of all, what do I have up here? I have the non-climate components. So it's much more than just a climate proposal. Some of the things that they talk about are should have been using this. Some of the things they talk about are a public bank. And the idea of this public bank is that it would finance, among other things, wind and solar projects, and also help to finance the dismantling of existing energy infrastructure, coal, fossil fuel type of stuff. Well, again, that's a tool for central direction of the economy. Another thing that this proposal includes is an idea for a federal guaranteed jobs program. Another thing is national health care, which is, again, it's not climate related. And then finally, possibly a universal basic universal basic income idea. I'm going to skip these things, not talk about them, but simply note that the Green New Deal is about replacing market direction of the economy with some form of central direction by government. So let's move more quickly to the climate proposals. And the fundamental idea is to eliminate fossil fuels within 10 years. That's a pretty drastic proposal. And that's the core of the Green New Deal program. That's the climate part. And the bottom line of my analysis, what I'm going to say here, is that what they propose is, first of all, physically impossible. If it were implemented, a number of critics have tried to calculate how much it would cost, and these they say, oh, so many trillions. It's not the right metric to use. The numbers that are calculated, like how much it would cost, don't make any sense anyway. The right metric to use is going to be how many people would it kill, how many millions of people would it kill. And I'm going to explain why that is. Even if this were successfully implemented in some sense, it would not cure the climate problem, because it doesn't do anything to address what the heck are we going to do if the future growth in emissions will come from the developing world. That's where it's going to come from. So how do you deal with that? There's no attention to it in this. So this is not a reasonable way to address climate issues. But let's assume for a minute that the Democrats win the presidency and the House and the Senate in 2020, and they pass this, and they are successful in implementing it, and we stop all use of fossil fuels in 10 years. What would it mean? And we've been told that maybe this is just aspirational. What is this going to aspire to? Currently, I don't have any fancy slides for this. I just talk about it. Electricity. Currently, about two-thirds of US electricity production is from fossil fuels. 32% natural gas, 30% coal. Natural gas has been going up, coal down. Natural gas has, on average, about 50% of the greenhouse emissions that coal does, so it's cleaner, cleaning it up. Small amounts of generation also from oil. And then, of the remaining electricity production, 29% come from hydroelectric, nuclear, and geothermal. About 7.5% are from wind and solar sources. Now the idea is to remove about two-thirds of this and replace it. But not to replace it, there's no chance of replacing it with hydroelectric dams, or geothermal. Those have particular siting problems. You've got to have the right kind of a place, and we don't have a chance to expand those things. Nuclear is largely off the table. Hardly anyone likes it. And so the idea is to replace fossil fuel capacity with wind and solar. To do that would require building, in 10 years, more than 9 times the wind and solar capacity that was built in the previous 10 years. At the same time, cutting the amount of electricity that is being produced from fossil fuel sources. That's because the Green New Deal also proposes heavy carbon taxes to help facilitate the shutdown. The idea is to shut down the fossil fuel production while at the same time trying to build this other stuff, which will take electricity to build, take power to build. But simply replacing the capacity, if we built that much wind and solar, isn't going to be enough of a solution, because current wind and solar power are intermittent. They are available when environmental conditions cooperate, not when we need them, not at peak times, peak demand times. And so you take it when you get it. Currently, we do not have technology that is capable of storing sufficient energy to make wind and solar feasible replacements for fossil fuel generated electricity. So almost everyone here went through this, was here in January, I guess it was. We had the polar vortex. Every time it gets cold, we have to have a new name for it. But it was the polar vortex. We had the sub-zero snap. Wind and solar production in Michigan fell to 21% of what they normally are because they didn't function in the sub-zero temperatures. Similar results occurred across the Midwest. That's actually quite dangerous. I don't know how many, I'm not going to ask for sure, but how many of you are capable of spending a week outdoors in sub-zero temperatures? Or spending a week in sub-zero temperatures? Okay, I admit, I've done it for fun. But that's what it is. Okay, it's dangerous. One problem of fluctuating energy also is that you get these energy fluctuations, but that jeopardizes the electrical grids. So you end up getting blackouts. You have to have consistent energy for these. And so it's very likely reduces the availability of electricity, and especially at peak load times, and those would be the times when you have extreme temperature issues, extreme hot, extreme cold. So it actually is life-threatening to face something like this, potentially. Simply from the standpoint of electricity, having the Green New Deal would be the equivalent of having a serious recession and a shrinking of the economy. Production necessarily would fall from reductions in electricity. So let's think then about transportation. And transportation, the Green New Deal would bring almost all transportation to a halt. Right now, 100% of truck transport is fossil fuel based. It's gasoline or diesel. That's all we have. Over 98% of automobiles in the United States are fossil fuel powered. To replace these in 10 years requires massive building programs, and that requires more, not less electricity. But we've already proposed ideas that are going to get us less electricity. To power them also requires more electricity. So when I said 9 times is what we need, 9 times the capacity to be built, that was simply to stay even, but we need more electricity if we're going to have powered automobiles and trucks. The trucks don't exist. Realistically, what has been suggested cannot be done. This would greatly reduce ground transportation, and that's another economic shock. And I should mention that cold weather, AAA studied this over this past winter. AAA says that cold weather reduces electric car range by 40%, and they define cold weather as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The technology isn't quite ready. Well, what about air transport? Well, currently, there are no alternatives to aviation fuels. There just aren't any. And there are none on the horizon. So this ends air transport. Now, I can guarantee you that if something like this were imposed, it were put in place, political leaders would not give up air transport. It would simply not be abolished. But government-permitted travel would be allowed. But the vast majority of commercial and personal air travel would end. Space travel ends. GPS, weather satellites, things like this, that stuff, there's no way to service them. Water transportation, except for a few sailing vessels and a few U.S. Navy nuclear vessels. And all boats and shipping run on either fuel oil or diesel or fewer on gasoline. That has to stop. Shipping on oceans, shipping on the Great Lakes, and on rivers would end. What's the old saying? Tough luck, Hawaii. You know what we're going to, you're not going home, boy, my friend. He looks like he could probably swim it. Agriculture. Let's take a look at agriculture for a second. Because currently the average American farmer feeds over 155 people. Primary production areas, of course, are in the Midwest, and they're in California. And of course, the rural parts of these areas. And so, first of all, what's the role of fossil fuels? Transportation. How do you get food from the places where it's produced to the places where people live? 100% of farm equipment is fossil fuel powered. At least 95% of fertilizer is produced from fossil fuels, and especially natural gas. That's the feedstock that is used in developing this stuff. The same is true for pesticides. Now, Green New Deal proponents envision a dramatic shift to small-scale, local organic agriculture. The people who are proposing this have absolutely no understanding of what modern agriculture is or how it functions. They have no serious understanding of how technical it is. I don't know how they're thinking we're going to convert wheat growing areas in Kansas or someplace like this, or convert the Corn Belt into things like this, and to do it so quickly. This is a pipe dream, and yet it is proposed as being a serious plan. It is not a serious plan. A few other things that are suggested, or that I just put down, suggested to take a few other things to take into account. Wind turbines and solar panels, what are they made of? They're made of carbon fiber, they're made of fiberglass, and they're made of plastics. And what are those things made of? Every one of them is made of fossil fuels. Lubricants, what are they made of? They're made of fossil fuels. Much of everything else that we use is made of fossil fuels. I can't show you this because this is Hillsdale, but my underwear is made of fossil fuels. Much of what we use is made of fossil fuels. We're not getting rid of it. The Green New Deal is an impossible proposal. There isn't any way for a modern civilization to do what is being proposed here. Great. Well, the proponents liken it to the Apollo program. This is not, I think, correct. The Apollo program did not require a complete restructuring of society, and it did not require adopting socialism. In the years before the moon landing, the NASA budget never reached more than 4.5% of the federal budget. It did that, I think, in 2 years. And except for those 2 years, it was always under. It was 3.5% of the federal budget or less. It was not a radical program in the sense that is being proposed here. The Green New Deal and also the IPCC proposals are much more akin to something else. They are much more akin to Mao Zedong's great leap forward. I'm going to say just a touch about that, but the Great Leap Forward was a catastrophe for China. It occurred over the period 1958 to 1962, and it was Mao's plan to radically restructure the Chinese economy. It led to the deaths of millions of people. Estimates are difficult to come by, but they say maybe 30 million people died over that 4-year range. The idea here that is being proposed is we're going to radically and rapidly restructure electricity production, transportation, agriculture, lifestyles, including diets, and ethical systems. That's what climate socialism proposes, and I'm against it. Yes, Ken.
I'm glad you're all here because the problem of the climate is certainly going to have a very big impact on your life. I gave 3 lectures on the physics part of it in February, and I featured some of the physics slides from the report which I'll show. It's super important that you educate yourself, okay, as to what's going on. Now, it's interesting that we have a metric, a very precise metric that measures how well we're doing. And that is how much CO2 is there in the atmosphere. That's precisely measured since 1958, and it's been growing exponentially with a doubling time of the anthropogenic component of 32 years. So that was 61 years ago that began. The IPCC was formed 30 years after that, in 1988. And it's been 31 years since the IPCC was formed, and there's been no change at all in the rate that CO2 has been going into the atmosphere. It's still exponentially growing, still with the doubling time of 32 years. So if we just keep doing what we're doing, that's just going to keep right on growing. And the reason that I gave my talks in February, and Charles is giving his talk tonight, is because the impacts on the world are now no longer ignorable. People are becoming aware of it because it's happening all over the place. And so something has to be done, right? Now I asked Charles, if we just keep doing what we're doing, we can totally expect that exponential growth of CO2 in the atmosphere to continue. What can we change to turn that around? Okay? What is your view of what we can change to turn that around? Because these people's lives are going to be greatly affected by it if we don't.
Okay. I have to say that I'm not an honest guy because it says the end. My history of thought students know that I'm a bad guy. I admit it. Now, first of all, first I want to say this is an excellent question. My initial response to it is not to you. It is to Representative Ocasio-Cortez when her Green New Deal, it's not hers, but when the Green New Deal that she is promoting was criticized, she said, well, if you don't have a solution, then this is it. That was her response. That's what I'm responding to when I have this next slide. Because the first thing I'm going to say is remember, well, I hate to say it, but remember the Three Stooges. Or remember this. And there's a reason I put this one out. If I can figure out how to make this work. Do you guys, a few of us know who the Three Stooges, I will have, incidentally, an answer in a second. But it is actually important to remember that what has been proposed, and what I'm talking about, is climate socialism. And the socialism doesn't solve the problem. That's not the point. The point is, first of all, this Latin term is, again, it's not my strong language, but prima non nocere is first do no harm. So it kind of captures the idea of the Hippocratic oath. And of course, in the Three Stooges story, Curly here, get this thing going, they're in a lifeboat. It springs a leak. And this was one of my favorite things as a kid. And what you will notice about this is the only way I could find to show this, because I couldn't find a clip where he's doing it. There's actually a hand drill here. When the water is coming up through the bottom of the boat, Curly grabs a hand drill and he starts drilling holes, and Mo says, "What are you doing?" And he says, I'm drilling holes to let the water out. Okay, you don't have to have a better solution to tell Curly to stop drilling holes. That's the first point. So, you just saw here my two main childhood influences. My parents who were MDs, plus the Three Stooges. That explains my the good and the bad. At any rate, let's move on. I want to go back and think, dang, I didn't. Well, let's, here's a solution, or an idea for a solution. And I want to, I'm not going to endorse this, but this is an idea that has been developed. As an economist, most economists look at this issue and they say, look, in one sense, it's very simple. And that is, the original problem is that we fail to take into account certain effects of production. Okay, we're producing goods, we're also producing greenhouse gases. And the greenhouse gases don't get figured into the cost side of things here. Suppose there's a way to do that, and then you can fix it. The problem is that there are effects not taken into account in decision-making, so-called externalities, and in this case, it's the damages that are done by the greenhouse gas emissions. So how do you fix something like that? It's fairly well studied, but a carbon tax that would reflect what is called the social cost of carbon. On October 8th, 2018, same day that the SR-15 was released, Nobel Prize in Economics was jointly awarded, but one half of it went to Professor William Nordhaus, whose work has all been devoted to studying social cost of carbon and the type of solution that would work for something like that. And it's fairly well studied, and there's an organization, the Climate Leadership Council, and this is one of the publications that he put out, is promoting this, a national carbon tax. Their idea, and to give you a few of the founders, James Baker, George Shultz, Janet Yellen, Greg Mankiw, Ben Bernanke, Stephen Hawking, now deceased, and many others. But the idea is that if this tax reflects the damages that are being done, nobody has an incentive to release greenhouse gases unless the benefits of doing so somehow outweigh the costs. Okay. You're going to take it into account that it has harmful effects, and it better be able to compensate for that. Okay. So there's a reduction in this sort of thing. The tax itself can be calibrated to hit any net emissions target or temperature target that you wish. And I think that I'm not certain, I think they picked 2 degrees rather than 1.5. The idea fundamentally is sound. One other thing that they propose are various trade interventions that would create incentives for China, India, and other places to get on board with something like this. Now, whether it would work or not is another question, but that's one proposal. It actually takes into account how would you make China interested in something like this. Now, I was asked by the Climate Council, just because I was on a list somewhere, to sign, not because I'm famous, but to sign an endorsement of this, and I thought about it, and I decided not to, and I'll tell you why I decided not to. It's because of another piece of work that has been done, and this is by a couple of economists, Derek Lemoyne, who is at University of Arizona, and Ivan Rudik, who is at Cornell. In December 2017, they published an American Economic Review, which is one of the more prestigious journals in economics, a paper. And they show that there's a conceptual error in the way that the standard calculations of an optimal carbon tax have been calculated. By optimal tax, what we mean is that it's a tax that would achieve a given goal while inflicting the minimum amount of economic harm in other ways. And so in this case, the goal is to keep greenhouse gases below the threshold that you would need for a 1.5 or 2 degree